part of why diversity leads to better results is because it's more difficult rather than less difficult. You got to get a bunch of people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different experiences to agree on the right way forward. Two things happen. They have to rely on data more, and they have to actually collaborate and come up with a good solution that they all believe is the right thing to do. And so it might take a little longer, but it's probably a better decision.
Hey, Luca here. Welcome to a new episode of the Refactoring podcast, where every 2 weeks we interview a world-class tech leader. Today's guest is Meri Williams, who is the CTO of Pleo and the host of LeadDev conferences for more than 10 years. With Meri, we started by talking about diversity, why it is such a controversial topic, why diverse teams make for stronger teams, and what are the mistakes engineering leaders should avoid. Then we took from her experience with LeadDev to explore what makes for a good talk and what Meri looks for when she selects the best ones. And finally, we explored how AI is going to change how we develop engineers and grow junior coworkers. So let's dive right into the action. Hi, welcome Meri, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Meri, you are the CTO of Pleo, which is one of Europe's leading business spend management platforms. And before that, you have held CTO roles at companies like Monzo, Helix, and Moo. And you're also known to thousands of engineering leaders as a longtime host of LeadDev conferences, which gives you a unique point of view, I should say, on the evolution of engineering leadership, which is a big part of what I would like to talk about today with you.
Yeah, we're excited to talk about that.
Yeah, so first of all, we love to start these chats by asking our guests about their journey in tech. How did you even get into tech?
So I started out as a bit of a hardware hacker. I used to just take things apart, or to be honest, my dad's a mechanical engineer. He would take things apart intending to fix them. And then sometimes he got a little distracted and didn't put them back together, and so I would. My mum's an accountant, my dad's an engineer. I've never been scared of anything technical or numbers or anything like that. And so I just was quite into it from an early age. I was really lucky in high school. I got to build part of South Africa's first satellite as a teenager, and meant I'll never be as cool as I was as a gawky 16-year-old when I soldered something that went into space. And then I went and studied computer science, so a very typical route into the industry, I suppose. Studied in the UK and then failed to go home. So my wife and I met at university, and so I stayed in the UK. And then the first 10 years of my career, I was at Procter & Gamble, so a big blue chip company, great at leadership development, great at a lot of things, but a little behind in terms of very modern tech. And so after 10 years there, I realized I was a little further away from the tech than I wanted to be, and left, and I was going to go to either Google or Amazon. And a guy called Tom Loosemore rang me up and said, "Hey, we're going to fix the government. Come help us do that. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." And so I joined the team at the Government Digital Service, and I built the team that built Gov.uk. And then that was my first big scaling gig. So we went from 30 to 300 people in about 9 months, which was very rapid scaling.
Wow.
And that was intense, but awesome. And then after that...
Actually, rapid scaling is not the first thing that people associate with government.
No, not at all, right? And there was this moment where Tim O'Reilly came to visit, and he said the most exciting startup in London right now is in the government, and I never expected that. So
yes,
it was very cool. And then I actually got a disability diagnosis at the end of my time at GDS and took a little bit of time off, and then I went to Vodafone briefly, and then I went back to being a tech lead. I went back to being hands-on. Did a tiny health tech startup that went a bit wrong, but the team stuck together, formed a product studio, and then M&S were our first big client. So we ended up slowly going in-house at M&S, and I ended up as the CTO for M&S.com before I was at Moo. So so I suppose I had this quite weird career in that the very corporate management-focused stuff was very early on and very commercial very early on. And then I've gone into scale-ups and startups at a later point, which is a little unusual.
Yeah, so it's basically the reverse of what many people experience in tech. Do you think that this kind of journey has helped you in some things that you were able to see early on that helped you during the rest of the journey?
Yeah, I mean, P&G was fantastic for leadership development. So I got a lot of coaching and mentoring and development very early in my career,
Mm,
which was good. I managed people from a much younger age than most people do.
yeah.
My first two direct reports were uh, older than my dad and very affectionately known as Statler and Waldorf, the two old men in the Muppets who sit up on the balcony
Yeah,
and shout at
yes.
everybody. And so that was a very intense first management experience. But I think it really helped. And I think I was very commercially aware at a much earlier point in my career than most people.
Mm,
So the finance side of things, the marketing and sales and understanding how a business fits together stuff, I got a lot of exposure to that very early on. And so there's a lot of things that I've realized later that um, a lot of other people don't get that exposure until they're a
yeah,
director or a VP or even a CTO. And I had it, as a 23-year-old. And
yes.
so this sort of upside down career has been really valuable from that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of the famous article by Charity Majors about the pendulum,
Yeah.
between engineer ICs and managers, where she advocates that it would be great if we could go back and forth between the two tracks at different times in our career, but it's always hard to do, right? I mean, it's especially when you're already into management, going back into becoming an IC, you don't always have this opportunity without looking weird, in your
Yeah.
resume. But I definitely believe adds a lot to what you know and what you can bring to the table if you're able to do that.
Yeah.
Hey, before we continue, I want to tell you more about today's sponsor, which is Augment Code. Augment is the only AI coding platform built for real engineering teams, not to vibe code, but to make real progress. And that's because Augment truly understands your code base. It has a custom built context engine that takes into account every repo and every file in your stack, scaling nicely to tens of millions of lines of code. So it can actually help to write functions, fix CI/CD issues, triage incidents, and review PRs, all from your IDE or from your terminal. Learn more on augmentcode.com. And how did you get into conferences, meetups, and LeadDev?
So the honest answer is when I was at P&G, I really wanted to attend conferences, and P&G was huge, and so they did all of their learning and development stuff internally. They didn't tend to participate much in, I mean, some supplier conferences, but mostly everything was done internally as training and learning and development. And so I started off speaking just so I could attend. So I did bar camps and refreshes and things like that, and slowly started to speak and then yeah, and ended up speaking primarily as a way of actually just getting to the conference because my employer
Yes.
wouldn't support that. And then over time, I became a bit better known as a speaker. I wrote a book back in 2008, and then the history behind LeadDev is actually quite funny. I did a geek meetup in Reading, and
Mm.
it was very small, and it was in the basement of quite a dodgy pub, and Ruth Yarnett, who's the CEO of LeadDev, happened to be there when it was still White October Events. It was a spin-out
Mm-mm.
company from an agency in Oxford. And she saw me speak on diversity and inclusion at this meetup, and then we kept in touch afterwards. And then she had the idea for LeadDev, and she came to me and said, "Hey, I want to speak to some tech leads about this idea I've got for a conference." And so I got a whole bunch of tech leads together for her, and talked to her myself, of course, and that kind of thing. And then after that, she came back and said, "Hey, we're going to do this conference about engineering leadership, and we'd really like you to chair
Yeah.
it. Would you get involved?" And so since the beginning, I've been involved as the kind of industry voice, guiding what we put on stage, and also very involved. Like Ruth and I both care a lot about representation and diversity and inclusion in the industry, and so
Yeah.
we've been a conference since the very beginning that made sure that that diversity was visible on stage, that we had representation on
Yes.
stage from very early on.
Yeah, actually, it's one of the things that struck me the most when I went to the event in London last month. It's really the amount of diversity and different voices that were represented at stage, where it's really incredible. And now it's been 10 years, more than 10 years, right, that you've been doing
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
Yeah,
10
so
years.
I want to ask you everything about it because, of course, tech changes all the time, but
Yeah.
this is engineering leadership. So, which is not only about tech, but also about things like how to work together, technical strategy, management, which are very human problems, right? And
Mhm.
so some of these feel like timeless challenges.
Yeah.
So if you look back at the last 10 years, can you point at like hard problems in engineering leadership that come up year after year, are always the same, just in different forms?
Yes, I mean, I think there's always something about recruitment. There's always something about diversity and inclusion because we continue to be an industry that hasn't nailed that yet.
Yeah.
There's often content or people wanting to talk about retaining people well. There's a
Mm,
lot of content over the years about working well within engineering, but also working well with other functions like product and
yeah.
design and data and similar. And so there's a lot of evergreen content as you'd imagine. Coaching and mentoring is something that comes up time and time again. Leading and managing and how those are different and how ICs need to lead as well as managers needing to lead comes up quite a lot. And so yeah, there's definitely a load of topics, and it goes through phases. You know,
Mm,
when everybody was hiring hugely, then there were lots of proposals to speak about scaling and rapidly scaling and how to do onboarding really well and those kind of things. And now, in the current reality, it's a little bit more likely that people are writing in with proposals about how to reward people when you can't promote them, or how do you develop people when promotions and growth might not be available, but you still want to make sure that you're developing people well. So
yeah.
I think there's always something a little timeless, but there's also always something that's quite of the moment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And speaking of different phases that we go through, you mentioned diversity and inclusion, which is a topic that is close to my heart. And unfortunately, I have to say that in recent years, we are seeing some of kind of an ugly pushback against it
Yeah.
in many ways. And there are plenty of, if you ask me, terrible takes about people believing genuinely that diversity is like against meritocracy and things like
Mm.
that. So you have been working on this for many, many years. So starting from first principles, why should we care? What do we say to these people?
Yeah.
And what do you say to someone who is more of a skeptic of this?
So I think I like the data. I like to rely on the data. So the data says diverse teams are more innovative, they're more profitable, they're more creative, they're more likely to succeed. And so if you want your team to be undiverse and uninclusive, you're saying you want your team to be worse
Yeah,
because the data says that those teams are better. And it's
yeah,
resolute. It's like very, very obvious. And then I think that people on the really specific thing about um, is it is it against meritocracy or not? I think that the only way you can believe that somebody who is from an underrepresented group is not not only not as good, but like worse than other people is if you fundamentally misunderstand how difficult it is for underrepresented people to do well in tech. Like
yeah,
particularly in the tech industry, if you are a woman in the tech industry and you have gotten to senior software engineer, it is at least twice as hard for you as it was for anybody else. And so if anything, I look at people from underrepresented groups and I know that they've had a harder path, that they've been held to a different standard, that they've had it so much more difficult in order to get to that point. They're almost worth more than somebody else in the same role. So it does affect meritocracy, but in the absolute opposite direction to what the skeptics think, right? They think that
yes,
you got a job just because you're a woman. Reality in tech is you got a job despite the fact that you're a woman.
yeah,
You got a job despite the fact that you're queer, despite the fact that you're a person of color or that you're a Muslim or whatever, right? And so for you to overcome that and still get the job means that you probably are significantly better than the next person who could have had that job because almost always people will take the path of least resistance and take the person who looks like everybody else.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love that you should have this kind of positive bias, instead because of this, because of the additional hardship. But I think that even if we agree, on the principles, I think that in many cases the execution of
Mm.
hiring and retaining a diverse team is hard.
Yeah.
And if there is something that we may agree with critics sometimes, is that we have all seen some, DEI programs that felt awkward or goofy
Yeah.
or not well implemented. The execution can still fall short, let's say, and do maybe more harm than good sometimes. So,
Mhm.
what is your best advice on creating a good, diverse team? I mean, what are the mistakes that you should avoid?
So I think when people are considering whether to join somewhere, stay somewhere, whether they're going to stick around and say yes to that promotion or whether they're going to head out, people are asking themselves three questions. And I think these three questions are really important to design around. They're asking, am I expected here? Is someone like me even
Mhm.
expected to be in this team? Am I respected here? Are my differences going to be seen as a bug or a feature?
Mhm.
And then can I be myself and be successful? And the trick with these questions is that they're in the reverse order of importance. The most important one to work on is to make it true that a number of different people from all different backgrounds can be themselves and be successful. Because if you have to spend time pretending to be something you're not, that's energy that you could be spending on the work. And so the number one thing is to make sure that you're an inclusive place.
Yeah,
Then you have the right to actually have diversity, to actually have people who are different from each other. And
yeah,
so I think the first thing to focus on is how do you level the playing field? How do you make it so everybody's got an equal chance at doing well?
mm,
Then worry about things like unconscious bias training and making sure that people are aware that they might be being discriminatory without realizing it. Then worry about how it looks on your website and whether enough people realize that you want them to
yeah,
work there, right? And I think that's the order in which to attack things. What a lot of people do is they go, let's make ourselves look good,
yeah,
attract people who are different, and then they're like, oh no, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? And people have this misconception about diversity, right? We think it's going to just magically make things better. It's almost like, you know, I said to somebody once, I'm not like covered in magical unicorn dust, and just because I'm gay and disabled and whatever, I don't just like magically turn up and have this amazing
and
effect
make
on
teams
everybody.
better. Yes.
Like part of why diversity leads to better results is because it's more difficult rather than less difficult. If it you got to get a bunch of people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different experiences to agree on the right way forward. Two things
Yeah,
happen. They have to rely on data more, and they have to actually collaborate and come up with a good solution that they all believe is the right thing to do. And so it might take a little longer, but it's probably a better decision. And I think that's where people have this misconception that it's just about throwing different people together and hoping. I think it's about putting different people together and then actively making it a good environment for great work to happen.
yeah, love this take. And one of the things that we always say about this is that it's very important to start early on because then everything compounds and then it gets easier. But let's say instead that you're a startup founder, you have kind of messed up. You have built an initial team of 30 to 40 people, and you haven't put much thought into that, and it doesn't look diverse at
Yeah.
all. Like, how do you fix the mess? How do you improve on this?
Yeah. So I think you start by saying, what are we doing that would make people uncomfortable or make them have to pretend to be something that they're not? So,
Mhm.
a lot of startups that get to that point, the 20, 30 people, they've ended up with some practices that are the way they are because that's a very
Yeah,
homogenous team, right?
yeah,
If your only social events are beer Wednesdays and foosball Fridays, then you're not going to attract a very diverse range of people. And so you
yes,
have to go, okay, let's start now making some events that are social events that aren't all about alcohol. Let's make some things that are during the day or breakfasts or something like that so that if we had people here who were parents or carers or whatever else, they could still participate. And I think you
yeah,
make those changes before you add the people who are different. And that's the problem that a lot of people have is they add the people who are different and then they expect all of the work to make it work to be on the people who are different rather than on the people who are the same. And it's the people who
yeah.
are the same who need to adjust.
Yeah. And I love your take because the focus here is not on people themselves, but on the actions and ceremonies and rituals that you have in place. Maybe you don't even realize that, where you are taking for granted so many things
Yeah.
and making them comfortable just for that homogeneous set of people without realizing that this wouldn't work at large, right?
Yeah. And you got two choices. You can wait and let those people reach the point where they have, kids and wives and husbands and everything else, and let them experience it not being as inclusive. And that's a very long-term play. Or you can, basically run a thought experiment and say, well, imagine somebody was here who didn't drink. How would they feel included in this organization? Imagine somebody who needed to leave at 5 o'clock on the dot every day because they've got to pick their kids up from nursery. How would they feel included in this organization? How would somebody who needs to pray multiple times a day feel included here? All of those kinds of things. And you just go, imagine they're here already. What would we do differently? Because
Yeah.
if all of those different people were there already, you would, of course, do things differently, because you would notice that they never came to anything social. They never were included in certain things because it was the wrong time of day. Like, you'd notice their absence and you'd adjust to it. And so this is just about making that change happen ahead of those people being there, not putting all the onus on them to change the rest of the organization, but changing proactively in favor of those differences that will come in.
Yeah, I love this because one angle that I think is not much talked about is that when we think of diversity, many people just think about genders, ethnicities, but it's about many things. It's about young people versus people with kids, for example. And I can remember when I was founder of my startup, we started, as a small team of very young people, and I thought personally we had done a good job of assembling like a diverse team, different perspectives, but I had discounted the fact that we were all like 20 somethings.
Yeah.
And then we raised our Series A, and we had to, in some areas, hire, the adults in the room, so people that were smarter than us on many things, more experienced. And we hired many people who were older, had kids, and all of a sudden, many things broke. Basically, because these people were available at different times, possibly they could not join some things, for the better or worse, and it took some readjustment. But there are so many facets, that contribute to diversity, and not just the most common tropes.
Yeah, and I mean, one area that's getting a lot of attention these days is things like neurodiversity, right? So just
Yeah.
people's brains being a little different, and how do you operate in a way that lets people who have ADHD or autism or both or other or dyslexia or similar, like how do you help them still be as effective, even though they might do things in a slightly different way than they might otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. So back to the conferences and all the work you have done at LeadDev, you have seen so many great talks, so many great speeches. Thinking about the highlights of recent years that you can remember, what's the secret sauce for a truly memorable talk?
I think memorable talks have got a couple of things. They usually have some element of a story. So there's
Yeah,
some personal experience or case study as part of them. They usually come with some sort of abstracted framework that you can take and use. And then in an ideal world, that they're memorable enough that you actually take that framework and do something with it. And I
yeah,
think that's the summary, is like make it personal, give some theory, but then make it really easy to take that theory and put it into practice. And I think that's the combination that goes really well. It's of course fantastic if you're a brilliant storyteller. It's of course fantastic if you happen to have had a unique experience. But I think those three things tend to shine through in the talks that stand out.
yeah. I love that my question was very high level, but you broke it down like the actual framework to to assess the talk. So, and I think you do a lot of selections, right? So
Yes.
you do assess for these things when you look at the talks that get proposed at the conference.
Yeah, so we score unseen. So we score without knowing who the speaker is.
Hmm.
So we score based on just the description of the talk, what the takeaways are, why they want to speak at LeadDev, and a couple of metadata things like what categories they think it's relevant to, what tags they would give the talk, and that kind of thing. And then I think we haven't really formalized it into those three things, but the kinds of talks that do get through tend to be ones where there's either a great case study, a great framework, or a real life application of things. And some talks have got all three, and some talks have just got one of those. But those are the ones that tend to stand out. And then these days, we actually get so many proposals for talks that we have a pre-review committee that scores the talks, and then we only take the top 200, 250 talks into the final stage where the host for each location, myself, and the team at LeadDev then score all of those talks, and then we go through and select. And the other thing that we do at the time that we're reviewing all the talks is we take note of what the themes are. So what are the types of talks that we're seeing over and over again? Is this the year where there's lots of content about junior engineers? I mean, this year there was obviously a lot of content about AI. Trying to make sure that the conference wasn't just an AI conference.
Can imagine.
This year. And then we tend to check back against the audience research that's done to see what people want to hear about, and that list of themes of what's come up through the CFP, and then we make the final decisions about exactly which talks we're choosing.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of work.
Yes, it is.
So, I asked you what's the secret sauce for memorable talk, but I love that you answered with all these criteria and how you work at the conference. So if I may expand the scope a little bit, what makes for a memorable conference? I mean, even outside of the talks themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think good talks are the mainstay of the conference. I think we wouldn't be anywhere if we didn't have great speakers.
Of course.
I think what LeadDev has gotten right is we've also got great sponsors. Like a lot of the sponsors are there because they genuinely think and can be helpful to engineering leaders. And so what we hear from our attendees is actually that they have really good conversations with the sponsors, and they're not feeling like they're only there to grab some swag and run away again. They're actually genuinely having good conversations. And so I think that's one part of it. And then what we're increasingly doing at LeadDev, as you saw in London, is we're doing other types of interaction as well. So we have workshops, and we have Ask Me Anything sessions, and sessions on how do you get to staff engineer, how do you get to VP of engineering, what do those roles look like? So we do panels and those kind of things as well. And so we've moved it from being a fairly pure single track conference where it was mostly just about sitting and watching talks, and now it's a much more interactive, choose your own adventure, multi-track, engagement type experience. That's why we called it the Festival of Engineering Leadership this last time, because we were trying to make it have a lot more opportunities to engage and lots of different things that you could do all at the conference at the same time.
Yeah, it's true. I think it also appeals to different types of people. There are people who generally like, more hands-on experiences, workshops and roundtables and close interactions, and those who are just, sit back and enjoy the talks. And I agree that creating something for everybody, it's really part of what makes for a great experience. And I also enjoyed a lot the multi-track, which is not something that you see at all conferences. So I think it was a great work. And another thing I wanted to ask is that I don't know about you, but over time I've known a lot of great engineers who had fantastic ideas, but maybe were a little bit reluctant or shy at the idea of presenting them on stage or joining, especially a major conference. So what do you do? What do you say to these people to convince them to go on stage?
So I think everybody's got something important to share, and just because you haven't realized how important your thing is yet doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And so I really encourage all kinds of people to think about what's the experience they've had, what's the thing that they do with their team that maybe is different and somebody else could learn from. And that helps. The other thing we do at LeadDev is we provide a lot of help to new speakers. So
Mm,
there's professional speaker coaching. You get a content check-in with the LeadDev team, so they'll help make sure that your story is hanging together well and your content makes sense. If you are doing a more technical topic, you can get one of the hosts, so myself or Sahel or Sarah can get involved and actually help review the content of your talk as well if it's more technical. Um, and so over the years, we've actually welcomed a lot of people that it's their first ever conference talk in front of 1,000 people.
yeah,
And that's I think that's on the one hand a little terrifying, but on the other
yeah,
hand, I'm really proud of the fact that we do take early in their speaking career speakers, and give them that opportunity. We've even had junior engineers speak at LeadDev before, as a kind of a pair of junior engineers came and said, like, here's what we wish you as seniors and tech leads and eng managers knew about us. And that was a really great session as well. So I think the main thing though is just to go, everybody's experience is unique, and there's something in what you do, in what you've learned, in what you've experienced that other people might find very interesting. So just figure out what it is and then figure out how to put it into a talk.
yeah, absolutely. And thinking about the benefits that you get for yourself, for your career, for your personal growth as a speaker or even as a conference host, how do these things help engineering leaders and engineers?
So I think a little like my early experience, I think it's part of the help is just to be at the conference and to meet all the other speakers and meet all the attendees and get to see the talks is genuinely useful. I think if we're doing our job right as organizers, then it's a genuine opportunity to improve at your craft and to get better at your job. And so I think that's one thing. I won't lie though, but the more you speak, the better known you become, and that can
Yeah.
have really positive side effects. I think as a CTO, I think I help companies with their employer brand by being there because people recognize me from LeadDev. I think it helps with recruitment and attracting the right people and retaining the right people as well. And so I think it can be very beneficial to your company as well, that you're part of these things. But it's a little double-sided because it also makes you not need your company as much if you're known independently. Um, and so
Yes.
some companies don't love it, really honestly. Some companies they don't love their people going and speaking because they know that it raises their profile and might mean that they get they get approached a bit more for roles and that kind of thing. But I'm of the opinion that it's on the company to make it a good place to stay, not to stop you having
Yeah.
options, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you may have this instinct, as an engineering leader, that you feel like you don't want, your employees to raise their profile that much. But if you should stop on your tracks and figure out, why am I even thinking this? If you think rationally, that doesn't make sense. Other than, of course, all the other benefits to the company itself that you listed about, the high profile of an engineer leader of a company translates into better profile of the company itself, I believe, for hiring, for reputation, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah. So before you said you had to do some work to avoid that the conference this year turned into an AI conference that I can imagine. And I enjoyed many actually AI talks
Mm.
about AI in the conference. And I really enjoyed the talk that you gave about how to grow engineers in the age of the AI. I think this is a really critical topic right now. And of course, there are many predictions about the future of engineering and with AI. And actually, one of the worst, the ugliest is that this is going to make the life of junior engineers worse,
Mm.
both when it comes to the job market and their professional growth. I mean, from all angles, right? So can you walk me through your thinking about this? How do we need to change how we develop engineers, how we grow engineers in the age of
Yeah,
AI?
I mean, I think that we used to be in the situation, us and also a number of other industries, as you saw in the talk. I interviewed people in architecture, like of buildings, and lawyers and people like that in preparing for
Yes.
the talk as well. I think that we used to have accidentally brilliantly scoped and shaped work for learning. And
Yes.
the reality with AI is that people review code a lot more than they write code, and they're reviewing code at a much earlier point in their career than what they would have done otherwise. A lot of entry-level engineers don't review much code. They're not yet trusted to do PR reviews and that kind of stuff, right? They don't have enough knowledge, they don't have enough expertise yet. But with AI, they're reviewing code all the time. And so
Yes.
one thing is I think we need to teach people to be better at reviewing code much earlier. What are those skills? How do you do it well? Um, how do you develop expertise when you're not going to have this sort of perfect learning journey that we used to accidentally have as an industry? And then I
Yeah.
think the other thing is that we're increasingly seeing that because people are almost skipping a step by going straight to having the AI write the code and then they review it rather than them writing it,
Yeah.
there's a real need for us to focus on foundations. So how do you structure things? How do you build securely? How do you make sure that things are performant? How do you predict what's going to break? How do you make sure it's not going to break? I think we're almost like speed running, needing to learn those things, having taken away the way that people used to learn it. And so I think we're
Yeah.
going to be in a situation for a while where we need to help people to use AI in the best way. And actually, some people, including some junior engineers, they're using it in really clever ways. They talk to ChatGPT about how they should structure the code that they're about to write. They try to solve the problems with Claude. They're not just jumping straight into code and into coding. They're thinking ahead of time about the structure of the problem, the structure of the solution. They're thinking about architectural topics more than they might have done otherwise. And so there is this opportunity to be much more thoughtful
Yeah.
ahead of committing the code. And then I think the other thing is that we're just going to have to be a little more deliberate in teaching these
Mm.
foundations that matter, all these different skills that used to kind of come for free in your first 2 or 3 years as a junior engineer. I think we're going to have to teach them a bit more actively um, and value them a bit more actively as well. It's the sort of thing that used to stop you getting to mid-level, but it wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily valued as when you were a junior. And I think now we need to value it much more. And I think we also have to recognize that some of the reason to have junior engineers is so that we have senior engineers in a few years' time.
Yes.
Like a lot of
Yes.
people, you saw in the talk I gave, 75% of entry level jobs have just disappeared almost overnight in the last year, and that's terrifying because if we stop 75% of people starting now, then in 5 years' time, we have a huge gap in the industry. And we've already got a gap in the industry now. Like, we can't handle an even bigger gap than we have today. And I just don't think that LLMs in particular, I don't think are going to replace senior
Yeah.
engineers who know how to build maintainable, scalable solutions because um, the tech itself is not likely to get better in that way, right? Like the
Yeah.
way that LLMs work is going to limit their ability to write good, scalable, maintainable code because they are, for better or for worse, they are increasingly advanced
Yeah.
autocomplete, but they are
But still.
largely, you know, stealing from what they've seen written before and predicting what you want to see. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think we'll continue to need we'll continue to need people who can care about scalability and
Yes.
maintainability and security and all of these non-functional requirements that nobody cares about when you're starting something, but become very, very important when you add to it over time.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many follow-up questions to this. One thing that I want, I remember when you, especially about this very last thing that you said about how you see this technology evolving. I remember the analogy in your talk with architects, for example, all the transition from when we used to draw by hand and then eventually with software. And there is this contrasting views about AI. There are people who say it's just productivity tech. that creates more productivity. We are creating more output. And so we have seen that, been there, done that many times, right? And then there are all the people who say, no, this time is different, right? And actually, anytime there's some new technology, there are always people who say, this time is different.
Yeah.
Do you think this time is different, or do you think it's like with architects, it's more productivity, but it's not going to fundamentally change what software engineers are expected to do on the foundations, on all the skills that you said?
I actually think it makes those foundations more important than they used to be. I think now when you can create so fast and so easily, it's more important to think about, okay, what happens when I change this? What happens when I need to come back and it needs to work for 10 times as many users? What happens when the database slows down and we have to optimize it? I think it brings some of those things further to the fore. And I think that's a little similar to what we saw with architecture, right? When they went from drafting by hand to computer-aided design to 3D modeling, over that time, the opportunity to learn the basics has reduced, but the attention to detail and needing to make sure that things work well and obey the laws in the case of architecture and the rules and how things need to be put together becomes more important. And so one of the things that you see in the world of architecture is they now do in the UK 3 degrees. They do an undergrad degree, then they do a degree which is all about more specialist skills. And the third degree they do is essentially partly a law degree and partly an architecture degree, because they have to be able to handle all of the legal aspects of running an architecture firm. And because you could go out and set up your own business on day one after you qualify as an architect. And I think we're going to start to see that same professionalism needed in software engineering. I think we're going to have more people who need to learn maintainability and security and all of these other things, because they're going to be needing to make sure that what the LLM has produced isn't going to break in future or break today or be unmaintainable or difficult to understand for people as they add to the product.
Yeah, and you always speak about foundations becoming more important than ever. And by the way, I agree on this. And I think, if anything, I mean, I remember when I was at university, right? And there was this kind of feud between professors, especially, who said, you have to learn in breadth. We have to teach you CS fundamentals, not the specific languages, not the specific frameworks. And especially us students say, no, you should prepare us to work for the job market. We should learn this and that, Ruby on Rails, etc., instead of Java, for example, right?
Yeah.
And I think, if anything, with AI, probably professors are even more right than before. I mean, the specific tech probably is going to be less important when it comes to the things that you hold in your head with respect to the fundamentals that we have been learning. I mean, the things that you say junior engineers need to learn more and faster are not the things that you study at university, are the things that you learn on the job, but you have to learn on the job earlier, right?
Yeah. One of the really interesting people I spoke to when I was prepping for that talk was one of our senior staff engineers at Pleo. And one of the questions I asked everybody when I interviewed them was, what work did you do as a junior engineer? What was your early experience of coding like?
Yeah.
And this individual talked about how he had started off in a team that was maintaining a legacy system. And the legacy system was creaking and breaking, and they had to do a load of refactoring and figuring out why it was on its knees all the time. And one of the reflections, I actually had a similar experience earlier in my career, and one of our reflections together was that kind of experience is fantastic, because you get to learn code smells and what to worry about and which things are going to break and which things are going to be too fragile and end up needing a call at 2 a.m. and that kind of stuff. And it's immensely valuable to do that. And if you don't get to work on existing code early in your career, it can actually disadvantage you, because you don't learn these things that happen with scale and with, time passing and dependencies not being updated and all of that kind of stuff. You don't get to experience that as early if you are mostly working on greenfield.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And also another trend that I'm seeing, I don't know about you at Pleo, but I remember, months ago when many people were concerned that junior engineers are going worse off with AI and seniors are going to become like 10x more valuable. But actually, my like experience and speaking with many people, what you see is that many times senior engineers are the ones that are most skeptical of AI, and I have a harder time becoming productive and familiar with the technology, more proficient, while junior engineers are the enthusiast ones that know all the tricks, all the prompting strategies, and if anything, you have to constrain them, not to be
Yes.
too productive, quote unquote.
Yeah, not to run too far ahead and get
Yes.
themselves into trouble. Exactly. And there's stuff that juniors have figured out that seniors haven't, right? Like every junior I spoke to said that ChatGPT is now an endlessly patient mentor, that they can ask the
Yes.
same dumb question over and over again and never worry about annoying them, right? And
Yeah.
I don't think seniors think of it like that. I think seniors, but also, in fairness to senior engineers, they're also more likely to spot that it's wrong. They're more likely to see that the code produced is not up to standard, or it's doing something weird, or it's calling variables that don't exist, or arguments in the function that aren't there. And so I think that skepticism is both justified because they can see the problems so clearly, but also is holding them back a little bit from being able to help people who are having a fundamentally different experience of being new in the industry than we had when we were new in the industry.
Yeah. So when you say that we should be more intentional about guiding junior engineers and making them grow on these skills that are now needed earlier in their journey, how do you envision that? Do you imagine like more intentional mentorship inside the company, having them involved in different types of tasks, pairing with senior engineers? Have you run experiments? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think we're definitely seeing pairing becoming or maintaining its importance. I think it's always been important, but I think it's extra important now. I think having design sessions as well, like technical design sessions, talking
Mm,
and thinking up front about how things should be structured is really valuable for junior engineers as well, because if you teach them how to do that, then they can do that with the AI as well, right? They can
yes.
use it for that structural thinking as well. um, and I think that there's also just some exposure to the things that can go wrong a little bit earlier needs to happen as well.
Mm,
I think it's very easy when you used to be a junior engineer, you would work on very small tasks. You would work on very small things, and the list of stuff that could go wrong was relatively limited
yeah.
in those very small things. Um, and now, because you're capable of doing a whole story or a whole bit of work, you're more likely to do that whole bit of work, but then the risks that come with that larger piece of work are more significant as well. And I think that's the so one of the things I said in the talk, as you heard, was I
Yeah.
don't know how to teach critical thinking. I need a philosophy person to help me know how to teach critical thinking. I can teach skepticism, but I'm not sure I can teach critical thinking, right? And I think learning critical thinking, learning how to know that code smells, learning how to spot that something's a security risk, learning how to spot that something is going to fall apart when under load. Those kind of things are quite difficult to teach. They're quite often something that comes with hard-won experience. And so I think in this world where people are racing ahead because it's now so much easier to churn out code, we're going to have
Yeah.
to catch up with figuring out how to teach these other skills.
Yeah, I agree. And I love what you said before about if we teach junior engineers how to work well with others, like we put them in technical discussions, we pair with them, then they're going to work better with AI too.
Mm.
Right, and get to those conversations with AI too. I mean, if we go back to your analogy that AI is like an endlessly patient mentor, to get the most out of a mentor, you still have to ask good questions,
Yes.
right? And that is a skill in itself that you have to learn.
100%. And I think that's also one of the differences you see with people who've gotten really into AI. Like Birgitta Buchler did an amazing talk at LeadDev London, all about, how things have changed over the last 2 years. And, she's really coming at it from the perspective of how do you deliver great software rapidly with AI.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reflections I had having watched her talk was the people who realize you should use it for more than just generating code. They're the ones that we need to learn from. Because I think that a lot of seniors just use it to generate some code, find that the code is not ideal, and then go, it'd be faster to just write it myself. And for them it is. But for the next generation, it won't be, because they won't have come up writing by hand as much. And so we have to adapt to this new reality where people are going to review code more than they write it.
Yes.
But in fairness, that's what real life is like. You review other people's code. You have to figure out how it works before you can add to it or change it or extend it. And I think that we're just going to have that experience much earlier in our careers than we used to.
Yeah, I agree. And then again, if you see it from the general delivery perspective, I think that most of the attention today is on the coding part. But coding is just one step, right? There is the review, as you said, there is like documentation, there is QA, there are many things. And if we only are able to take advantage of AI, or we are mostly able to take advantage on one thing, on coding, we are creating bottlenecks in other things. I mean, I think we'll need to think holistically and understand how to use technology across the whole pipeline and not just in our IDE.
Yeah. It's a systems design problem, right? It's a systems thinking problem. We have to look at the whole piece, not just this one sliver of it.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Meri, for this chat. I loved it, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.